Okay, so what we're seeing here with the whole concept of the agent provocateur is the attempt to essentially to feed history as the folks in charge would like it to be, directly into the media mill, to have it come out the other side and be consumed by the people who consume news, which is the average taxpayer, the average voter, who probably already is a little nervous about the Black Panthers, the fact that the Black Panthers carry guns, the fact that the Black Panthers feel that they are themselves political refugees within the state. This makes the average person nervous. Then when the average person is told on top of it that these people are actively planning violent crimes, that they're being shot down in internecine, interpolitical group warfare, things of this nature, it becomes easier and easier for the people who are being force-fed this kind of news to accept virtually anything that is being told to them. So the agent provocateur is not only somebody who is used directly to affect a political movement, but is used also to affect the body politic as a whole, to make people frightened, to make people nervous, and to make people more likely to accept whatever is going to be done to them, for them, and supposedly with their permission.
Now, the next agent provocateur, well, actually, fortunately for us, it was not a successful operation, but the next attempted provocation on behalf of the criminal conspiracy section was truly a monstrous plan, and very significantly here, this involved not only elements of the FBI and CIA, but also apparently elements of the Nixon White House as well, and we're going to take a look at possible connections between this conspiracy and Watergate, indications that perhaps the conspiracy we're about to outline, or the proposed conspiracy, it was fortunately scotched before it had a chance to reach fulfillment, was in fact what Watergate was all about. Quoting again from Lewis Tackwood, the they here, by the way, is the criminal conspiracy section, the people in the glass house. They have an overall plan. You see, like I say, most of them are sergeants from the start. Most of them make money you wouldn't even believe. And their major plan, let me tell you, their major plan is that they want a full police state. I don't just mean California, but all over. They talk about it all the time. Total police state. You see my point? And when they get to the top of the organization, they're saying that whenever it comes, they're going to be number one man, number two man, and I'm going to tell you, they talk about making that big dough. See my point? Plus the prestige of being on the top. I'm saying people who are involved are now looking at the future. Wow, when we do get this police thing, phew, look out. They got a plan working right now. What they're trying to figure out how they can get Nixon to declare martial law. It's in the planning stage right now. He would create martial law, and that would give an excuse to arrest hundreds of people. Hundreds and hundreds. See what I mean? And once they arrest all these people, I'm going to tell you there'd be no stopping it. Even if tomorrow morning you say martial law wasn't in effect, you see my point? They'd still have been out there, and they got control out there now. In other words, this would be a police state ever afterwards. So basically what we're talking about here is the formal establishment, as Tackwood said, of a police state or of an overt fascist government.
Continuing.
Okay, I was just going to say, what Nip is about to read you next are some details as to how they were going to get Richard Nixon to declare martial law.
Continuing with Tackwood's observations, quote, "There is a plan right now that is so monstrous that it is pathetic. It entails a detailed plan to blow up the Republican convention. It has been worked out by the super agencies at CCS offices with the FBI present, down to the minutest detail. The blame will fall on militant organizations demonstrating in the convention. The President will then be asked to declare a state of national emergency and martial law. Within 48 hours, they will arrest all known militants on the left, and a police state will then exist within the American democratic structure. And when the 48 hours is over, the President will have given over the powers to the police, who will not relinquish that power. In a sense, we will be under total police scrutiny. The super agencies plan to cause a disruption, create a bombing, in other words, a killing, and blame left-wing militants."
Now, the next section of the Glass House tapes we're going to read concerns how the Squad 19 conspiracy, as it eventually was to be called, the plan to blow up the Republican convention in San Diego, blame it on the left, and to use that as an excuse to create martial law in the United States. We're going to take a look at how this was foiled. Basically, to make a long story short, and we're going to provide you with the details here. The criminal conspiracy section, the Citizens Research and Investigating Committee, the CRIC, the co-authors of this book with Tackwood, got together and investigated the allegations of Louis Tackwood, substantiated them, and then broke them to the mainstream press as well as the underground press. Not only did Tackwood pass a lie detector test on his allegations with flying colors, he also was able to have his story corroborated by 3 mainstream journalists in addition to CRIC. The journalists are Carl Fleming of Newsweek, Jerry Cohen of the Los Angeles Times, and Leroy Aarons of the Washington Post. And CRIC described this as follows. The undercover agent had now surfaced to tell his story to the world. He began a 7-hour marathon interrogation with Fleming, Aarons, and Cohen. Armed with the material scoured from the hidden corners of Tackwood's past, they took him back over his 10-year career with the precision of good investigators. No detail of his life as an agent was left out. They had names, dates, and places of incidents in Tackwood's past that had been lost in the recesses of his memory. At the end of the 7 hours, the reporters were convinced that there was a big story, perhaps one worth a congressional investigation. They only had to convince their editors to run it, and for that they needed to have Tackwood take a lie detector test. An examination was set up by Cohen with the well-known polygrapher Chris Gugas in Hollywood. Gugas, by the way, is G-U-G-U-S. Tackwood came to Gugas's office accompanied by CRIC members. Gugas was reportedly a trusted professional who had high recommendations. But when CRIC members learned Gugas was an ex-sheriff's officer and noticed the framed autographed picture of Gugas and J. Edgar Hoover, they wondered if they had fallen into a trap. Chris Gugas had more the appearance of a dentist than a polygrapher. He wore a long white smock and horn-rimmed glasses and walked with sort of a cock's strut. He kept a secretary who seemed never to have anything to do. Gugas conducted a preliminary test and decided Tackwood was too high-strung and nervous to go through with the examination at the time. He recommended that he be put up overnight to relax, with a private detective to guard him. The press put up the $100 for the night, and everyone returned home wondering what the results would be the next day. Events began to turn quickly now. CRIC was beginning to have doubts about what press intentions were, and consequently began to move ahead with plans to break the story open to other media. Arrangements were made with KPFK to have a press conference in their studio where it would be broadcast live in Los Angeles and Pacifica's sister stations in Houston, Berkeley, and New York. The polygraph test of Tackwood was held the next day. His allegations were vindicated. Under the curious circumstances, it was difficult to tell who was more surprised, CRIC or the press. Yet all the accusations against CCS and their conspiratorial activities were substantially verified by the polygraph. Perhaps more amazed than anyone was Chris Gugas. He asked Tackwood to return the next day in order that other questions concerning his police work could be gone over in more detail. So the point here being that not only were some mainstream journalists able to confirm Tackwood's story, but he passed a polygraph test with flying colors.
Continuing with the description of the press conference that had been scheduled, the press conference was held as scheduled on November 13th. Tackwood was a virtuoso. There was no going back for him now. The bridges were burned. The story in print was now irreversible. Chief of Police Davis's only statement to the press was, quote, "There has been a Bolshevik trying to plant this story on the police for the last 2 weeks. I didn't think the press would take it seriously," unquote. Tackwood's candid reply was, quote, "What's a Bolshevik?" unquote. The story was run nationwide in the Post and the Los Angeles Times, the left, black and underground press, radio, and television. Tackwood even made a short newsreel with some private filmmakers. The story was picked up in Europe and Latin America with great interest. It was a media sensation for a week. Skipping down. On November 20th, 1972, Secret Service agents arrived at KPFK to begin an investigation of the San Diego conspiracy. And I think it's highly significant, the use of the phrase, it was a media sensation for a week. One of the things we've talked about on this broadcast, and people who turn these broadcasts on for the first or second time oftentimes have difficulty believing some of the things that we are sharing with the listening audience. But those who wish only need to think back to the House committee that looked into the Kennedy assassination for the second time. Realized that committee, a House, House of Representatives, U.S. Congress, Congressional Committee, came forth with a finding of probable conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination, and basically the nationwide reaction was, so what? As a matter of fact, I believe it was the New York Times that wrote an editorial on its front page that said, okay, so there were 2 lone nuts in Dealey Plaza. So again, now the Tackwood story, it's not at all unusual, and it's not at all surprising, and it's all too sad to realize that, as they say, the story was basically a media sensation for about 1 week, and the only people who really seemed to take a lot of notice of it was the Secret Service.
Right. Now, it should be added that there was, in addition to the information already presented, additional information surfaced corroborating Tackwood's stories, the investigations of Fleming, Ahrens, and Cohen, as well as underground journalists, and of course, the polygraph test, which Tackwood passed. And I think it's also worth noting that some of the people who came forward to corroborate various aspects of Tackwood's story were actually from relatively conservative backgrounds. It's important to distinguish, and a lot of people don't distinguish between a fascist, and we talk about fascism and fascists all the time, and a real conservative. A real conservative is going to be appalled by fascism, and a lot of real conservatives were terribly appalled by the plans of the Nixon White House, the Reagan administration, and the various police and intelligence services to declare martial law and stage this monstrous provocation. Further corroboration of Tackwood's story is contained in the passage I'm about to read you, and very significantly here, there are indications, and this is the part of the discussion we're going to be getting into now, that the Squad 19 conspiracy, what Tackwood was into, the CCS plan to blow up the Republican convention in 1972, was inextricably connected to Watergate, and that basically when Tackwood came out and in cooperation with CRIC and the journalists, broke the story about this impending provocation, that what simply happened is the convention was switched to Miami, and the types of provocateur to be used were switched. And we're going to look at some intelligent speculation here by CRIC and some interesting coincidences that would indicate that perhaps the Watergate burglars were involved in a lot more than just political espionage, that they may very well have been involved with hiring provocateur to disrupt the Republican convention. They had certainly been involved in hiring provocateur in other situations. Continuing again with the Glasshouse tapes. In the spring of 1970, William Howard, a Washington, D.C. reporter for the conservative Newhouse chain, published a story about a contingency plan to cancel the 1972 elections, unquote, which he claimed he learned about from the wife of a Rand Corporation executive. There was a virtual news blackout on the subject. According to Howard, the president had ordered the Rand Corporation think tank in Santa Monica, California, to do a feasibility study, unquote, of the cancellation possibility in 1972 because of Nixon's concern about possible disruption by the left. The Wall Street Journal wrote April 24, 1970, rumors that the study had been ordered were hard to spike, unquote. The Los Angeles Free Press picked up the story and was told privately by persons at Rand that it, quote, had done a good and right thing in publishing the story, unquote. We now come to Tackwood's strange San Diego conspiracy. This weird scenario became known to the world as the Watergate affair. Quoting again directly from the Glasshouse tapes themselves. I'm not going to show CRIC. I'm not telling nobody all what I got on Squad 19 on the San Diego conspiracy, but I'm going to show you some of it since it's starting to come out anyway. But I'm not giving up everything because, man, this is my only life insurance. You see where I'm coming from? I'm giving up only 2 names. There's Martin and there's White. All right, now Martin was the code name for my contact, and I'm going to tell you he's CIA all the way. Are you ready for this? He was in Dallas when they got Kennedy. He left out of there for the Caribbean, and Martin is in on the cancellation of the election some way, and in on the concentration camp thing. Do you see what I'm saying? Now the control, the man over Martin, is White. I only heard a little about him, but they say he's the money man. Nobody's over him but the top dogs. Martin and White. That's all I'm going to give you now. This is my life insurance. 8 months after that tape was made by Louis E. Tackwood, 2 mystery men were catapulted into the headlines. Their names were McCord and Hunt. Their various code names included Martin and White. These names were used by several operatives. The Watergate affair began on June 17, 1972, with the arrest of 5 men in the Democratic National Committee offices located in the Watergate Hotel, Washington, D.C., the home of John and Martha Mitchell. A $1 million suit was placed against the Committee for the Re-election of the President for compensatory and punitive damages to the Democratic headquarters. Charges in the suit may include unlawful interception of wire communications, as well as unlawful possession of wire devices and burglary. And I would add here that this book came out in '73, the year in which the Watergate story broke. James McCord wrote his letter to Judge Sirica, which precipitated the public airing of the story, or as much of it as did get aired publicly, in March of '73. So the Watergate case really had not broken as such when this book came out, and that's worth noting here, because the scenario being presented here by CRIC was really before the public as a whole knew about Watergate. Now again, Martin and White were the name of Tackwood's contacts, linked to the Kennedy assassination, the, quote, concentration camp thing, as Tackwood referred to it, namely the overt plan to turn the United States, for all intents and purposes, into a fascist country and establish martial law. And we're going to go on here and take a look at CRIC's further discussion concerning the Squad 19 conspiracy at Watergate.
Continuing with the CRIC's explanations, what was actually happening at the Democratic National Convention headquarters, and of course they're referring to at the time of the bugging, that was the precipitating agent for what we know as Watergate. Electronic devices were involved, but that seems to be the least serious activity. Within 6 weeks of the first arrest, it was known that at least 12 men and $114,000 were involved. This was obviously not a, quote, bugging budget or squad. The invaders were discovered putting forged documents of some kind in files, not taking papers out. They were not burglars. These were only the first major contradictions. The men, wearing evening clothes and rubber gloves, carried electronic devices so sophisticated that, according to the New York Daily News, they could have been used for, quote, months without detection. These veteran clandestine operatives are the same men that sources close to the White House called, quote, circus tramps and burglars. Also, in the team's possession were, quote, incendiary and bomb manufacturing devices and implements, according to the Washington police. They had previously planted a super-sensitive listening device in a fire alarm box. The men had been in the Democratic Committee offices before, and the listening devices were still working. In fact, as they broke and entered, another team of agents was dismantling a listening post in a motel across the street from the Watergate complex. One thing was perfectly clear. This espionage mission was involved with far more than eavesdropping. As the investigation of the event unfolded during the 1972 presidential campaign, it became clear that Watergate was but the tip of the iceberg. Hundreds of thousands of dollars and scores of men were revealed as part of a national network for political espionage, sabotage, and provocation. The contacts for the provocateurs, who were then recruited, turned out to be men from the White House, some of the president's closest advisors. Well, as we will see in a moment, in fact, they were some of the president's closest advisors, and the partial unearthing of Watergate caused the downfall of the presidency of Richard Nixon. However, even we do not know the full story today, and obviously the full story was not known at the time of this book was being written. As Dave mentioned, it was published in 1973. Watergate was undoubtedly a more complicated affair than we have been shown so far. The fact that Watergate itself would have virtually disappeared had it not been for the fact that James McCord, one of the aforementioned Martin and Smith duo, along with E. Howard Hunt, got a sudden attack of conscience on as the case was falling apart against he and Hunt and the rest of them, and wrote a letter to Judge John Sirica, basically blowing the whistle and setting the whole thing up. Some people have suggested that McCord's act was, in essence, the delayed fuse for a CIA attempt to push the Nixon administration out of office for some reason, or at least to put pressure on the Nixon administration. There are a variety of suggestions that have been proffered having to do with Nixon's and Lawrence O'Brien, the Democratic National Commission chairman. Lawrence O'Brien's connections along with Nixon's connections to Howard Hughes. The real thing, though, that is obvious, and we will see, and again, a little bit more in a moment, is that Watergate was not merely the act of a bunch of Republican politicians trying to bug the Democratic headquarters to find out what the Democrats were going to say in their speech that night.
Now, of course, one of the aspects of the Kennedy assassination that we've discussed, or one of the aspects of Watergate, I should say, that we've discussed in the past, concerns the intersection, the massive intersection between the people involved in the both investigation of and cover-up of the assassination of President Kennedy and Watergate. In our Guns of November series, we did Guns of November number 3 in large part about the connections between Watergate and the Kennedy assassination. So the indications that the Squad 19 conspiracy may have been at the root of Watergate, and that the planned provocation was simply switched from San Diego to Miami pursuant to Tackwood's allegations, is intriguing in light of the fact that Tackwood mentioned that his control was, quote, in Dallas the day they got Kennedy, unquote. Remember that, and we're going to proceed with more interesting information concerning Watergate and the indications, well, the certainty that the Watergate burglars had been involved in far more than just political espionage. As indicated in the passage Nip just read you, the Watergate burglars were putting things into the files in the Democratic headquarters, not taking them out. In addition, they had incendiary devices, which remains to be seen what they were going to do with those incendiary devices, but the speculation has been that they were going to try and link these leftist provocations to the Democratic Party as a whole. And again, there are a lot of indications that had the burglars not been arrested inside the Watergate Hotel, that some sort of massive provocation would have taken place at the Miami convention, at the Republican 1972 convention. Returning again to the Glasshouse tapes. Here is what can be reconstructed so far. Howard Hunt resigns from the CIA and is hired by the White House at the behest of Robert C. Odle, Jr., an assistant in 1960 to both John Mitchell and Richard Kleindienst. Setting aside speculations about those over Hunt, we can trace Hunt as he contacts James McCord, who, according to the Washington Post, headed a Pentagon unit, quote, that develops lists of radicals and draws up contingency plans for the censorship of the news media and the U.S. mail, unquote. McCord is employed by several GOP committees. His take-home salary is $1,209 a month. McCord had received some $3,000 extra for equipment purchased. The radios the team had when arrested were licensed exclusively to the Republican National Committee. Hunt also contacted his old subordinate from the 1961 CIA Cuban adventure, Bernard Barker. Barker shares offices with Miguel R. Suarez, a Cuban exile lawyer prominent in Republican politics in Florida, who the New York Times of June 19, 1972 connects to former Governor Claude Kirk of Florida. If we follow the force of the worm's eye view of Tackwood's revelations, we now have the following scenario. When the Tackwood revelations and the ITT scandal forced the GOP convention switch to Miami, Cubans replaced blacks, Chicanos, and Jesus freaks as Provocateur, but the new team would still be run, unquote, from Washington, D.C. by White and Martin. The clandestine operation. The committee to re-elect the president sets aside massive amounts of money for, quote, intelligence gathering and other steps to prevent disruptions of the Republican National Convention, unquote, the Washington Post reports. 9 men, all registered with false names taken from spy novels written by Howard Hunt, Jr., stayed at the Watergate Hotel May 26th through 29th, and again June 17th through 18th. All of the 5 men caught in the Democratic headquarters were connected with the CIA in some way. The other relationship they had in common was having worked together for the CIA-planned Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba.
Continuing with the Glasshouse tapes, considering the Tackwood allegations that were made public in October of 1971, McCord's job, it's James McCord, of course, McCord's job of maintaining security at the conventions was equal to securing the electoral process. Bernard Barker was telling people in Miami that, quote, something was going to happen at the time of the conventions, unquote. He was busy planning demonstrations in approval of Nixon's bombing of the Haiphong harbors. On April 24th, Barker and a secret team of 7 men went to Miami to hire provocateurs for a New York demonstration. 4 of this team were arrested at the Watergate Hotel. 3 were in Miami at the time, and 1 left the country because he was, quote, headed for trouble. There were plans for a May demonstration that was moved to Washington, D.C. after J. Edgar Hoover's death. Paid demonstrators were hired to make an ugly scene while Hoover's body was lying in state. Money to pay for street scenes and fights with police and radicals came from the same money man, Bernard Barker, who served as the conduit of funds for the Bay of Pigs invasion. This time, Barker was handing out crisp, consecutive $100 bills that came to Miami's Republican National Bank from a secret source in Mexico via a secret source in Chile. James McCord, chief of security for the Republican National Committee, was paid for the Watergate job with the same funds that hired street altercations. Barker's wife said that her husband had not been active with the Cuban community for 5 years. She was surprised he was arrested working with that group again. That observation fits in with the Squad 19 plan, which was arranged for San Diego. When the convention was moved to Miami, a whole new group of street people would have to set the milieu for confrontations. Some persons could be imported. Local varieties would be better. The radical, emotional, well-trained, constantly provoked Cuban exile community could be worked up sufficiently with enough of those CIA $100 bills floating around again. One man in Miami was offered $700, quote, CIA money to demonstrate on the streets in August for the conventions. Kenneth H. Dahlberg, Nixon's campaign finance chairman for the Midwest, turned a check for $25,000 over to, quote, Maurice Stans himself, the former Secretary of Commerce. That check, plus another $100,000, was then deposited to the account of Bernard L. Barker, the Cuban conduit for the affair. Barker handed out $30,000 to the Watergate men for hotel expenses and elaborate equipment. $10,000 went to the Washington May Day provocations. Frank Sturgis was planning demonstrations for the Republican conventions. 2 private Catholic colleges received a call from Sturgis asking for, quote, lodging in August for young Republicans. He left his phone number at Bernard Barker's real estate office. Sturgis also called Berry College, said he was, quote, an organizer, and wanted rooms for 200 places. Where were these young Republicans coming from? Douglas Caddy, attorney for the men arrested, was co-founder of Young Americans for Freedom. That group is infiltrated with radicals, extremists, and many who supported Agnew for president. Eugenio Martinez, real estate partner of Barker, was making his own reservations to bring in about 3,000 young Republicans for convention time. Depending upon the background, training, beliefs of a paramilitary, religious, violently anti-communist element, there is no way of telling if Martinez, Gonzalez, Barker, and Sturgis were planning to import trouble. If they hired provocateurs for the May demonstrations in Washington, who were they making these reservations for in August?
Okay, now, that concludes the portion of our broadcast in which we're going to deal with the book The Glasshouse Tapes and the various conspiracies detailed within it. Summing up what we've looked at before we move on to the next major focus of our broadcast this evening, the Symbionese Liberation Army, which, as we're going to see, was an extension of the whole nexus that we were just looking at of police intelligence agencies, federal intelligence agencies, the executive branch of the government, in this case the Nixon White House, and street-level agents provocateurs, people like Lewis Tackwood, Melvin Cotton Smith, James Carr, and so forth. Now, as indicated by Lewis Tackwood and corroborated by the numerous investigations into the criminal conspiracy section, CCS was sort of a super police agency. Although it was nominally part of the Los Angeles Police Department, it not only operated freely all over the entire state of California, it operated outside of the state of California as well, and it did so in conjunction with the FBI, CIA, and in the case of the Squad 19 conspiracy, which in all probability gave rise to Watergate, with the Nixon White House as well. We took a look at the deep sixing of radical black activists in California, the harassment and elimination of many Black Panthers in cooperation with Criminal Conspiracy Section and groups like U.S. of Ron Karenga. We took a look at the deaths of George and Jonathan Jackson and how the Criminal Conspiracy Section was involved in setting up those incidents. We also took a look at the death of James Carr. The most significant of the operations put together by CCS was the proposed and fortunately aborted Squad 19 conspiracy. This was a plan to declare martial law in the United States, basically to set up an overt fascist dictatorship by staging a monstrous provocation. The Republican 1972 convention in San Diego was going to be blown up by agent provocateur. This would be blamed on the left and used as an excuse not only to arrest leftists and progressives of all types, but also to declare martial law and establish a total police state. The Squad 19 conspiracy was, as we saw, involved with FBI, CIA, and the Nixon White House. And as we looked at in the discussion of Watergate, there are a lot of indications that Watergate was simply a switching of this very same scenario from San Diego to Miami, with people like Bernard Barker and Frank Sturgis, who, it is a matter of record, hired agent provocateur for other areas, appear to have been importing several hundred members of Young Americans for Freedom, among other groups, into the Miami area. In Radio Free America number 11, the second of our programs about the Aryan nations, in which we talked about the John Birch Society, we took a look at how Young Americans for Freedom was used, among other things, as a front for the importation of U.S. Army intelligence agents into the Dallas-Fort Worth area in 1962 and 3 to participate in the assassination of President Kennedy. In light of the documented connections between the whole Watergate cast of characters and the cast of characters involved in the Kennedy assassination that we talked about in Guns of November number 3, our archive series about the Kennedy assassination, and in light of Tackwood's statements about his control having been in on the Kennedy assassination, that's an interesting sort of historical thread to bear in mind. Now, what we're going to be doing next is we're going to focus on the very same complex, prison reform, prison activism on the part of reactionary elements, because activism, as we know, can take place on many different sides. And we're going to take a look at the whole police, federal intelligence agency complex, again, using agent provocateur, specifically agent provocateur nurtured within the political system, the manipulation of certain black militants to achieve certain ends, that is, for the police department. And we're going to take a look at what was probably the most famous of all of the terrorist incidents which took place almost like an epidemic in California under Ronald Reagan, namely the Symbionese Liberation Army. Now, for the Symbionese Liberation Army discussion, we're going to be not only relying upon, but to a considerable extent reproducing a very, very important article which regrettably is very difficult to come by now. This article was called, "Why Was Patricia Hearst Kidnapped?" It was authored by Mae Brussel, whose work is aired here on KFJC, the home base station for the Radio Free America tapes. By the way, her program is aired Monday night at 9, or that's on KKEP. Wrong station. I air her tapes on a couple of stations here in the Bay Area for those who will eventually hear this broadcast on another station, and there are some now that are playing them. The Mae Brussel tapes are aired Sunday morning at 9 and repeated Thursday evening at 9, and Mae is the greatest of researchers in this field. The article we're about to reproduce to a considerable extent will give you an indication of why she is a deserving holder of that title. Mae Brussel's article, "Why Was Patricia Hearst Kidnapped?" was published in the Realist magazine, and specifically in the Realist's summer issue for 1974. So this is from the Realist, summer of 1974. It was this article took up the entire issue of the Realist. It was called "Why Was Patricia Hearst Kidnapped?" Now, before we get into the article, and as I say, we're going to read almost half the article, almost half of the text in the context of this program so that it can, at least the meat of the article can be reproduced because it's almost impossible to come by. Perhaps a word would be in order here about the Realist itself. The Realist was a magazine of political satire published by a man named Paul Krasner, who I think has actually revised a new Realist, so to speak, many years later. Although very amusing in a lot of respects, the Realist as a whole, and I'll speak strictly for myself in this regard, is not something, although it's amusing as satire, it's not something I place much weight on or favor particularly at all. Krasner is essentially a humorist. However, with three articles that he published in the Realist, "Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped?" Mae's first article in the summer of '72 dealing with Watergate. Then her second article is the Senate Watergate Committee part of the cover-up in the summer of '73 dealt with Watergate. And her last, and in my opinion the greatest of her articles, was "Why Was Patricia Hearst Kidnapped?" again published in the Realist issue of the summer of 1974. These three articles published in the Realist are a dramatic departure from the Realist's usual format, which was deliberately irreverent political satire. Irrelevant, perhaps, certainly irreverent. I make this distinction because Krasner, as a humorist, and his work, although interesting, is not to be taken as anything else as a whole. However, he did depart from his role as a comedian or a political comedian in order to publish May's articles. Unfortunately, with the last of these articles, Krasner included the footnotes in the text and then did not print the footnotes at the end. That, in addition to some financial squabbles, signaled the formal break of the relationship between May and Paul Krasner. As a result of his refusal to publish the footnotes and some other things, May broke off contact with him, and this was the end of what, in my opinion, was the best work Paul Krasner ever did, namely his publishing of May's 3 articles. But unfortunately, although the article is lavishly researched and the footnotes are in it, the footnotes were never published. I can tell you that most of the material in this article was simply gleaned, as is May's specialty, from the news accounts of the time, where May simply sat down, made notes, and collated the various news accounts and came up with most of the incredible discrepancies and absurdities in the official version, which we're going to be examining at length. In addition, May Brussel, who was a member of the Citizens Research and Investigating Committee, the group that put together the Glass House tapes, the book we just finished reading from, May was very, very active in the California prison reform movement. She got to know many inmates in the California prison system at considerable length, and they provided her with a lot of the inside information about the formation of the SLA, things that were not in the news media. In addition, the following acknowledgments were listed by May at the end of the article. Donald Freed, of Citizens Research and Investigation Committee, CRIC, author and researcher, Executive Action, Agony in New Haven, Inquest, editor, The Glass House Tapes. She gives his address. Lake Headley, that's the man's name, that's not a place, by the way. Lake Headley, Headley, independent investigator, chief investigator in the Billy Dean Smith case and in Wounded Knee. Stephanie Caruana, Caruana, a writer. The Fifth Estate CARIC Counter-Spy Campaign Organizing Committee, Post Office Box 647, Ben Franklin Station, and that's in Washington, D.C. That is the organization that eventually went on to publish Counter-Spy magazine, now known as the National Reporter, one of the best publications on the covert intelligence establishment in this country. Sherman Skolnick, Citizens Committee to Clean Up the Courts, and that gives a Chicago address for him. And the last acknowledgement here is prisoners from Vacaville Medical Facility and Soledad Prison who have risked their lives to assist in exposing Donald DeFries's contacts while in prison. In addition to those sources, as I said, much of the information about the SLA here comes from May's comparative analysis of the news accounts of the time, also from her exhaustive cross-indexing and research with the volumes of from the Senate Watergate Committee, just as May did with the Kennedy assassination, in which she cross-indexed the entire 26 volumes of the Warren Commission testimony and exhibits, and it took her 9 years and generated 27,000 pages of typed double-spaced commentary. May did the same thing with the volumes of the Watergate hearings. She simply sat down, went through them with a fine-tooth comb, and cross-indexed them. A lot of the information in the Glass House tapes about Watergate was gleaned from those very hearings by May. And Watergate, again, will be in the background of the scenario developed by May for the Symbionese Liberation Army, and her work with the Watergate, the volumes for the Watergate hearings, was front and center there as well. This article is approximately 40 pages in length. We're going to be reading about 20 pages to you in an attempt to sort of, as best we're able to reproduce the guts of this very, very important article that May wrote on the Symbionese Liberation Army. So again, this is Why Was Patricia Hearst Kidnapped?, published in the Realists issue of the summer of 1974. The first section of May's article we're going to read here is called Cast of Characters, and it's exactly what the name implies. It's basically the people involved in this organization. Cast of Characters: The California Connections. Donald DeFries, Camilla Hall, Nancy Ling Perry, Patricia Soltysik, and Joseph Ramiro. Importations: Migratory Birds. Angela Atwood, Gary Atwood, Emily Harris, William Harris, Russell Little, Robin Steiner, William Wolfe. Patsies: Donald DeFries, Patricia Hearst. Victims: Dr. Marcus Foster, Donald DeFries, William Wolfe, Camilla Hall, Angela Atwood, Nancy Ling Perry, Patricia Soltysik. Military agents, intelligence agents, and police: Wes Davis, Dr. Frederick Hacker, William Harris, Ron Karenga, Ludlow Kramer, Joseph Ramiro, Chris Thompson, Colston Westbrook, Attorney General Evel Younger, 6 migratory birds from the east. Allowed to vanish, Peter Benenson, Jean Chan, Joanne Little DeVito and Joseph DeVito, Amanda de Normanville, Dave Gunnell, Bernard Keaton, Tom Matthews, Mary Alice Siem, or Siem, S-I-E-M, Theo Wheeler, and 3 unnamed black agents of the Los Angeles Police Department. Then the detailed background of the various players in this event. Angela Atwood, alias Deborah K. Cruz, or Crus, C-R-U-S, General Jelena Angela DeAngelis. Graduate, University of Indiana. Trained by CIA think tank, the College of Foreign Affairs, University of Indiana, Bloomington, Indiana. Worked in a mod squad, unquote, setting up narcotics arrests for the Intelligence Division of the Indiana State Police. Angela's father, a Teamsters Union official in New Jersey. Never discussed with her best friend how she met husband Gary or why she married him. Quote, nobody could get near him, unquote. Moved to Oakland, California with husband Gary Atwood, Emily, and William Harris, summer of 1972. Upon arriving in Oakland, Angela immediately volunteered to work for the United Farm Workers and Los Venceremos, both highly infiltrated by the federal government at the time. Visited Vacaville Medical Facility and prisoners in the Black Cultural Association. Described personally as warm and sensitive, wanted to be an actress. Not politically sophisticated upon arrival in California. Employed as a waitress at Great Electric Underground in the Bank of America building, San Francisco. A close friend was afraid Gary might kill Angela. He had beaten her up. Gary and Angela maintained separate sets of friends. Their husband and wife relationship was similar to that of known espionage agents. Gary moved back to Indiana in the summer of 1973. In the fall of 1973, Angela severed other friendships, saying, quote, I am into my own trip now, unquote, and moved in with Emily and William Harris. November 7th, 1973, one day before the arrest of Ramiro and Little. November 7th, 1973, one day before the arrest of Ramiro and Little, Angela Atwood bought a .380 caliber automatic Mauser pistol and registered it in her name. Library card of Gary Atwood was found at the Sutherland Court address after Ramiro and Little were arrested. Surfaced as General Jelena after the Hearst kidnapping. Was found dead in the house on 54th Street in Los Angeles 24 hours after the 5 other bodies were discovered. Gary Atwood. Married to Angela Atwood, who trained with Emily and Bill Harris setting up narcotics arrests for the Intelligence Division of the Indiana State Police. Moved to the West Coast, summer of 1972, with Angela and William and Emily Harris. Occupation in Bay Area not explained. Taught part of the time in Chinatown. Political involvement, all talk, unquote, described as indoor entertainment like an intellectual exercise, unquote. Threatened to blow off the head, unquote, of a friend who didn't join his revolution. Spoke of Nietzsche, Superman, revolution, and Palestinian guerrillas. No evidence of political activism other than verbal. Not identified with prison or radical groups. Mean disposition. Angela told a friend, quote, if you think he is bad now, you should have seen him, unquote. Nobody could get next to him. He didn't like to be touched, unquote. Summer of 1973, Gary went back to Indiana to library school. Angela's body remained unclaimed for 3 days after her death. Friends called Gary. He signed the release for her to be buried in New Jersey. Peter Benenson, mathematician employed at Lawrence Laboratory, Berkeley, a sensitive government agency. He was tied up inside his car on the floor while 5 persons kidnapped Patricia Hearst. He heard the shootout coming from the apartment as they exited. Benenson's car was used to drive to a waiting white station wagon, and he was left tied up inside the car. He released himself and walked 1 mile to his sister's home where he spent the night. The FBI and police were not notified for 24 hours about the use of his car for the kidnapping. He refused to be a witness against anybody, claiming that he didn't see faces, unquote, when he was tied up. A letter to the Berkeley Barb, February 22, 1974, stated, quote, the manipulators are brother and sister, both by blood and in mind. The male is a mathematician with the UC radiation lab. His was the car commandeered in the kidnapping, unquote. The SLA had in their possession books that might have come from Benenson, Chemical Biological Warfare, The Science of Public Death, and the Genetic Effects of Radioactivity. Jean Chan. Oriental girlfriend of David Gunnell, owner of Peking House, unquote, where SLA members lived. Visited Vacaville Medical Facility, tutored black culture there. No information on her background or any training which would qualify her to tutor in the prison system. Sold Chinese food from a food stand on Bancroft Way with Gunnell. Police stopped a 1965 station wagon in connection with Dr. Foster's murder and questioned a female Oriental. A number of firearms were found in the vehicle 3 weeks before Patty Hearst was kidnapped. If Jean Chan was the person questioned, she was never identified.